Welcome to another interesting episode of Open Book on Location. I'm Katie Poole, the board chair of the Literary Alliance and a passionate reader like you. Now in our 12th year, our all-volunteer nonprofit provides these fabulous conversations with your favorite authors. At our website, PasadenaLiteraryAlliance.org, you can find more author interviews, make donations to the Alliance to allow us to provide grants for literary initiatives, and participate. Send questions for the authors or contribute author suggestions at the Contact Us tab. See you soon at Open Book on Location.
Happy to be talking today with Laurie R. King, my longtime friend and colleague and co-editor and things like that.
Fellow Sherlockian.
Yes, and fellow member of the Baker Street Irregulars, and author of about a zillion books.
Yes.
Is it a zillion yet?
Yeah, I think a Brazilian.
So we've talked about some of these things before, but not to the same audience. So bear with me if you've heard some of these questions from me before. But talk a little bit about what led you to take up writing in general. Why did you want to be a writer, or maybe you didn't?
Oh yes, I wanted to be rich and famous.
Better choosing next time.
Yeah, I should have gone into teaching. Writing was one of those things that if I had been in the modern school system where you actually meet authors, they drag in authors of all sorts and stick them in front of completely bemused kids ranging from school age to high school and beyond, and say, this is an author, look, they've written this book. I might have put it together earlier that people wrote these things, but as it was, I'd never met an author until I became one. And it wasn't until I hit my 30s that I had this idea that, maybe I could write a book. And so I started writing in my early 30s and got about halfway through what turned out to be a science fiction book and realized I had no idea how to finish it. So I just kind of put it aside, and I had small kids and, but a few years later, and my daughter was in school and my son went off to kindergarten, to preschool, I guess it was, 3 whole mornings a week. And I started writing, and I sat down and wrote. I was 15 when I first met Sherlock Holmes. And Mary Russell just kind of walked in and took over. And since then, I've been extremely fortunate. It has nothing to do with hard work, although I do work. But, there's luck that comes into it. And I've been lucky.
Were you a storyteller before this? Before you started writing?
I was a huge reader. But I think it's a kind of like, if you move to a foreign country and you don't know the language, you start by sort of picking up phrases, and then you start picking up more phrases. And after a while, you start forming your own sentences, and then eventually you become fluent. And I think to some extent, those of us who don't take classes in writing, it's that kind of thing, that we learn how to write by absorbing the rhythms and patterns and styles of storytelling. And that's how I did. As I said, I was 35 when I sat down to write what became The Beekeeper's Apprentice.
Right. So Beekeeper's Apprentice was not your first book published, however.
No.
So did you give up on it? I mean, it's sort of, I know you were struggling to have it published. You decided to write something completely different.
Well, I wrote Beekeeper, and I wrote a second one, which was actually structured to be the third book, because I needed to write what their relationship looked like eventually when they were partnered. And I wasn't ready to write that interim book. So I wrote the third book. And then, as nobody seemed particularly interested in publishing either of those, who knew? I wrote one that was closer to my time, closer to my home, about a cop in San Francisco. And it allowed me to do some things with storytelling that I couldn't really do with the whimsical setting of Sherlock Holmes and Mary Russell. But I then decided that I wanted to write something that was a more serious kind of story, about a woman artist, sort of female Rembrandt. And as it happened, that one was the first to be bought by St. Martin's Press, the first one published. And because it was what it was, it won the Edgar Award for Best First Novel that year. And I think, looking back, if we had published Beekeeper that first year, the first book out, I don't think it would have won an Edgar.
Did the Edgar help you then get Beekeeper published?
Well, it was already in the works, because with small kids, you sort of don't have, it's not really practical to turn out a book a year when you have small kids. So by the time they published A Grave Talent, the first of the Martinelli books, I had 3.5 books in the works. And when my editor said, "So what's next?" Fortunately, I didn't have to say, "Oh God, I have to write another book," because I had these books on the shelf, and I could say to her, "Well, I don't know if you're interested in these, because a couple of people have not been. But I have this kind of flaky story about this girl who meets Sherlock Holmes." And my editor then, Ruth Cavan, who's an absolutely lovely, lovely woman, was interested, bought it, and then there we are. So.
Well, and there we are, what, 15 books later? Is that
16,
what we are?
16, I think, yeah.
16, I've lost count.
Yeah.
So one of the questions we got from a reader was, why did you decide to write about Sherlock Holmes? I mean, sort of been done.
These are books about a young girl with an extraordinary mind. She is a sort of young female feminist, 20th century version of the great detective. I love some of the ad campaigns that they're running that have to do with meet the world's greatest detective and her husband, Sherlock Holmes. Because, she is this extraordinary mind, and they happen to meet, and he's fascinated by the fact that she thinks like he does, and she becomes his apprentice, obviously, in the first one, and they then become partners, and then they marry, because that's where partners went in the 20s. I think that they are, to my mind, they're more interesting than just a book about Mary Russell, because I could have written that character by herself in the teens and 20s. I could have written her as a cop in San Francisco in the 1980s. I mean, she's an interesting person on her own. But I thought it was really fascinating to look at two very similar minds encountering each other, and how they were different, how they were the same and yet how they were different. And I think that the places in the books where the two of them lock horns and argue and face off and challenge each other are what a lot of readers find the most fun, and certainly they're fun to write.
And you drew from life to some extent on that. That's my psychological analysis. You were married to a man who was considerably older than you.
He was not Sherlock Holmes.
He was not Sherlock Holmes, but he was a great intellect. Did you have those kinds of debates and arguments? You were a theology master, a master's degree in theology, as I recall.
I often wonder what married couples who have nothing intellectual in common have to talk about. Whereas Noel and I could sort of use shorthand when it came to his academic life because I knew where he was coming from. I could explain his jokes to his students because they were usually based on some extremely obtuse and arcane academic point. I don't think he ever really understood what I was doing. He never really got the idea of fiction.
Fiction?
But, yeah, I mean, he didn't understand how fiction worked. I think the only novels other than those of mine that he read, that he had read were things like Chinua Achebe, Things Fall Apart, that he used in his classes on African traditional religion, and Salman Rushdie's Satanic Verses. I mean, his puzzlement over Salman Rushdie's Satanic Verses was, I don't think someone could survive falling out of a plane.
So you switch back and forth between, let's call it contemporary fiction and historical fiction. You have you have a standalone that's contemporary. The Kate series is now contemporary.
Yeah.
The Touchstone series is not, and the Mary Russell books all take place in the teens and the 20s.
Yeah.
What's different for you about the way that you write the different kinds of books?
I mean, obviously you've got the question of research, because if it's something that is your life, there may be areas that you have to research. The San Francisco Police Department, the legal system, forensics, that kind of thing. But when it comes to writing something in the 20s, or in The Murder of Mary Russell, I had a lot of it in Victorian times. You're starting from a whole different perspective, and you have to be able to write about not only the technology, but to be able to capture the kind of vocabulary without making it difficult to understand. What my friend Dana Stabenow calls writing forsoothly. You don't just stick in odd words because it makes it sound ancient and historical, but to capture how people would move and how people would do such a simple thing as get a cup of tea is so entirely different from our daily life that you have to be able to do enough research to immerse yourself and feel as though you're sliding back into a familiar pool when you start writing a historical series. It's one of the reasons why it's nice to write a series, because you don't have to repeat the research for every book. If you were changing from the 20s to the 50s to the 1890s, I mean, that's a lot of vocabulary you're learning.
What are your go-to tools? What are the most important parts of your research in terms of books? You've also done travel as part of your research.
Yeah. I mean, I will often find, for travel, the Baedekers that over my shoulder, you can see my Baedekers piled, some of my Baedekers piled up there, because they're really convenient to get a sense of what's important and what's there. Journals, diaries are much better than historical novels. If they're novels written at the time, they're very valuable because it gives you a sense of what was important, how people talked, and what sorts of things were available to them. So that if you're writing about the 20s, it's much better to read the early Dorothy Sayers than to read something that's written now set back in then. When it comes to writing about individuals, because I often insert real life people into the stories, it's much better if you can find actual letters and diaries rather than memoirs, because memoirs are worked over. Memoirs are a time recollected and reshaped and not necessarily detailed enough for a historical novelist's purposes. Whereas if you have a series of letters that somebody writes talking about what riots are going on, or how the water is stopped in Jerusalem, or anything, it gives you a very distinct flavor of the time and place. So anytime I can find collected letters or journals are great.
So having written both contemporary and historical fiction, I'm not asking if there's a preference, but I mean, are there things that you can do with historical fiction that you don't feel like you can do with contemporary?
Oh yeah, I mean, for one thing, I can have amateurs involved in crimes, which, you know, it's a little more difficult when you have Kate Martinelli, who is a cop, bringing in outsiders to an investigation. I mean, there's a lot of places she can't let them walk for fear of
I was very disappointed that when I appeared in one of your Kate novels as a character, I was very disappointed I didn't get to do any real investigation, you know?
I know.
Oh, well.
I know. But in the 20s, of course, you know, you can just drag them in. You don't have Miranda rights to worry about. You don't have.
Well, so this is a good segue to tell us about the new Russell that comes out in
June 9th. Yeah. Riviera Gold. I wrote about Mrs. Hudson, the longtime first landlady and then housekeeper of Sherlock Holmes. And I wrote about her wild youth in a book called The Murder of Mary Russell 2-3 years ago. So I'm revisiting her and her equally wild friends in Monte Carlo. And so this is set in the Riviera. It has the Murphy set, Gerald and Sarah Murphy, who collected writers and painters in Paris in the 20s and established the whole summer in the Riviera cult. The two of them decided that they liked it in the summer, and so they just stayed on. It was a winter resort until then. So we're having a lot of fun in the Riviera.
Want to show us the cover?
Yeah, this is just the advanced reading copy. The covers themselves are not out yet. But
all right, so coming to a bookstore curbside near you soon. Bookstores will be open again, everybody. Yes.
Absolutely.
For curbside pickup of books, no browsing. So know what you want ahead of time. Okay, well, thank you, Laurie. I'm going to talk with our other guest, David Morrell, for a bit,
Absolutely.
and then we'll all three of us have a chat. David, welcome.
Hello.
Nice to
Thank
see you.
Well, yes, under these strange circumstances, normally we, all three of us have conversations at conferences.
Yes, and we might as well put in a plug that David, Laurie and I have been editing a series of anthologies by new to Sherlock Holmes writers, by writers who have never been sort of publicly associated with Sherlock Holmes before. And David was kind enough to write a wonderful story for us about primarily about Conan Doyle, but incidentally about Sherlock Holmes. And I think that's in Echoes of Sherlock Holmes. I think that's the name of the collection. So, but that's not why I wanted to include you in this conversation today. I wanted to include you because, you know, after writing thrillers for a long time, you went bad, you went wrong, and you started writing historical fiction. And I wanted to talk about how that happened. But let's start with, how did you come to be a writer? You were an honest professor first, I think.
I had a troubled childhood. My father had died in combat, and my mother wasn't able. I was I was young when he died, and my mother wasn't able to raise me and support us. She was a seamstress, and she had to go out of the house. So I was in an orphanage for a time. And as I get older, I realize how much I was traumatized by that experience, especially because I wasn't told what was happening. I was just put there. And my mother eventually remarried and reclaimed me. The stepfather didn't like kids, and my mother and stepfather fought, and I slept under the bed. Literally, I slept under the bed. And I told stories to myself in which I was the hero rescuing people. And I find this interesting, that I wasn't the victim, that I was the rescuer. The one turning point in my life was when I was 17. This is obviously many years ago. A television series called Route 66 premiered, and anybody who knows me has heard me do this little riff because it was so important to me. The series was about two young men in a Corvette convertible traveling across the United States. The slug line was in search of America and in search of themselves. And I was just the right age, and it was filmed on location, and I somehow saw an escape. But what's important here is that I didn't want to be the actors, that there was something about what they were saying and how the plots were delivered that made me realize, as Laurie had said about meeting, about learning, my heavens, authors, people actually make these things, that I realized there was a writer behind Route 66, a man named Sterling Silliphant, who later received an Oscar for adapting John Ball's novel In the Heat of the Night.
In the Heat of the Night, yes.
And I had this fantasy that I wanted to do what he did, but I didn't know I wanted to affect other people the way he had affected me. A mixture of ideas and action. So I went to a library, and whenever I tell this story in public, I ask if there are any librarians, because a librarian changed my life. I went to the library and said, I don't suppose you know how to get a letter to Screen Gems, which was the production company. They said that at the end of the series. And I was certain that this was an impossibility. And the librarian gave me this kind smile and came back 5 minutes later with Screen Gems address. So I sent a letter. I was 17. I couldn't type. It was handwritten, probably poorly scrawled, and I sent it to Screen Gems, to Sterling Silliphant, and by God, a week later, I got a letter back. And the letter began, Dear Mr. Morrell, which is a joke. I was 17. Dear Mr. Morrell, I'm terribly sorry I took so long to respond, but I was out at sea at the time your letter arrived. He was an avid, he liked to sail. And he said he couldn't read what I'd written, which was a good thing. And that if I wanted to be a writer, this is how it was done. I should write and write and write and write and write some more. And eventually I would meet other people who were interested in writing, and we would talk about it. And I would write and write and write and write. And eventually, if I had something to say, I would meet someone of influence who could help me. And he said it was that simple and that terribly difficult. And that's what I set out to do. And there was no hope that I would finish high school, but I thought, well, maybe I should, and read better things. And I wound up going to college, to everybody's surprise. And in fact, I went on and got a master's degree and a PhD, and then was a full professor of American literature. So it shows you what a librarian can do without knowing the, every moment is an opportunity.
So after writing about 1,000 thrillers, not quite that many, but it seems like it sometimes. There's so many, and they're so wonderful.
Thank you.
You decided to write about the early Victorian period. And
I
how did that come about? Tell us about that. And why, and what did you end up doing to research that period? What attracted you to that period?
Well, I'd always been interested in the Victorians, but just to back up, this is my 48th year as a published author. So if I have 30 books, so it sounds like a lot, but if you take 30 into 48, if I think it's not enough, but that I, I work on them until I get them the way I want them, and sometimes they take a while. So in fact, I had written a historical novel earlier. It was a historical Western called Last Reveille. Back in '77, it was published. And it was about the bandit Pancho Villa raided a Columbus, New Mexico town, a New Mexico town called Columbus in 1916. And the First World War was on, but America had not yet entered. And Germans were in Mexico. And the theory was that maybe Villa had been working with the Germans, or if he wasn't, by heaven, the whole southern part of the United States was open. So Congress voted an emergency session and sent the military into Mexico without invitation. We invaded Mexico. And that was led by Blackjack Pershing with many later famous generals of World War II who were then very young, such as Patton, as a lieutenant. And this was fascinating to me because it mixed airplanes, motorized vehicles, and cavalry together in what was an interesting mix. I just couldn't resist it. And then I did then a lot of thrillers, but I'd always had that historical thing in mind. And so in 2009, my granddaughter, Natalie, who was 14, died from a very rare bone cancer called Ewing sarcoma. And this was, by rare, I mean 200 people get it in the United States each year. It's very difficult to treat. I know this prior because my son died from the same disease in 1987. He was 15. So and my wife, and of course my daughter, and it's just a terrible way that grief comes together for everybody. And I needed to escape. So this is what happened. And there's a movie called Creation, which is about Charles Darwin's nervous breakdown when he was writing Origin of Species. Because his favorite daughter, Annie, died with hydropathy treatment, which was common, as you all know, at the time. But she, as near as we can tell, suffered from rheumatic fever, from heart issues, and so the water treatment may have killed her. And Darwin sort of suspected that. But also, his wife, who was a devout Christian, felt that maybe God had sent this affliction to stop him from writing on the Origin of Species because people's faith would be tested. So he was a mess. And he had all these various problems. Basically, he was having a nervous breakdown and didn't know it. And the book, the film is about how he became adjusted to his grief for his daughter. So about 2/3 of the way through, a messenger shows up, one of those thankless roles, and the messenger says, Charles, there are people like Thomas de Quincey who say that we can be affected by thoughts and emotions we don't know we have. And the movie for me stopped right there. I knew vaguely about de Quincey, right, but because of his opium addiction, he frequently wasn't taught. And I thought, wait a minute, is this film suggesting that Thomas de Quincey, this is a 1850s movie, that Thomas de Quincey anticipated Freud by a half century? And off I went. And discovered that, in fact, de Quincey had anticipated Freud, and it wasn't just by a half century, it was way before that. And I thought, it's one of those moments when I said, the fact that De Quincey had written a wonderful essay called On Murder Considered as One of the Fine Arts, where he praised serial killers, in effect, mass murderers. And I thought, why don't I do a novel in which De Quincey tries to explain to Scotland Yard, newly formed, and they think they're hot stuff because they have plaster casts of footprints. And he's going to tell them about the chasms and sunless abysses of the human mind. I just could not resist this. And basically went down the rabbit hole into into 1854 as an escape from my grief. And for many years, several years, that's where I lived in my imagination. And it helped me adjust to my granddaughter's death. And Laurie, one of you mentioned Barbara Peters, perhaps before we were recording, I can't recall. But Barbara Peters, when she read Murder is a Fine Art, said, and of course, you were channeling your granddaughter when you were writing about De Quincey's daughter, Emily. And I really freaked out. I thought, the chasms and sunless abysses of the human mind, that all of that was going on. So basically, that's why I went in that direction.
Well, he's a wonderful character, and you managed to stay in those chasms, etc., for 4 books in the series?
3 books and a long short story.
Okay. Well, your readers want to know, at least this reader wants to know, will we see more of De Quincey?
We will not. I spoke to my publisher, and there was no interest. So
publishers.
Well, that's the way it is. In 1916, if we want to look at history, publishing changed twice. Once in 2009 with the improved Kindle, which basically revolutionized the ebook delivery system and made it possible for many more writers than before to have their works available. Sometimes needing a little editing, but another issue. And then in 2013, it changed again when Netflix decided to fund very expensively House of Cards and pay a movie star salary to a movie star, Kevin Spacey. And that was considered crazy, but what was more crazy is Netflix said, and they were going to make all the episodes available simultaneously. And people in the industry thought this was nuts. But in fact, it changed home viewing because
and it changed, I think, also for the much better, the relationship of writers and the media. Suddenly you didn't have to see your beautiful De Quincey novel turned into a 2-hour jumble. It could be an 8 or 10 or 12-hour careful telling of a story. And to me, that as a viewer, that was the huge change, was to see books that I love now adapted into wonderful limited series.
The short form series, 10 episodes, 12, became the equivalent of novels on streaming and television, however people watch them.
So David, what are you working on? What's coming up for you? What's coming out soon?
I'm very confused by where publishing is going. I sense a contraction of subjects as publishers compete with streaming. So what I see is that big publishers are going for the common denominator in response to streaming, which tends to be niche. Streaming is about a whole bunch of different stuff, but publishers seem to be going for that common denominator. And I don't write domestic suspense or domestic noir or whatever it's called in the manner of Gone Girl, and that's what I was advised I should do. And I'm sorry, I can't do it. I've always done what obsessed me, and so what I'm writing is in fact a historical novel, a historical Western. which is I'm calling a novel of the American West, and it's a meta-Western. It's a Western about Westerns. It incorporates all the history of Westerns within the narrative. And at the same time, it has very deeply buried all kinds of references to the classics. And I don't, aside from something like The French Lieutenant's Woman, which was a contemporary imitation of a Victorian novel, I don't know of anything like this that's ever been done before. So it's quite unusual, and maybe it'll be done by the end of this year. But it's heavily historical.
Interesting. The only thing that even I can even think of remotely similar is Thomas Berger's Little Big Man, which is a sort of modern take on the 19th century Indian stories and all that. Well, David, that's great. This could be the beginning of your successful career. Finally, you know, it's.
Well, I've always been perverse. Another author once said to me, "What are you working on?" And I told him about I won't mention the author. I mentioned that I was doing these Victorian novels. Murder is a Fine Art. I might as well mention the titles. Murder is a Fine Art, Inspector of the Dead, and Ruler of the Night. And so I explained all this, and he said to me, blank, 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 you reinvented yourself again. And the blank, blank, blank was fairly vulgar.
But you seem to have done that repeatedly and very successfully.
That's what I finally realized I did. It took me 48 years to realize what I did was investigate genres.
Absolutely. I mean, this is, you know, Hollywood can't give up Rambo, but thank you, you did.
That's been a strange adventure, a whole other subject. But I did outdoor action with Rambo. Then I did a series of influential espionage novels, Brotherhood of the Rose and so forth. And then for a while, I was writing non-supernatural horror, which had an influence. And it really surprised me that it took that long to say, that's what I do. I get interested in genres, and then I tear them apart and rebuild them.
Well, this is a good time to turn this back into a three-way conversation. Laurie, you were laughing.
I see Laurie laughing. Why are you laughing?
She was laughing when you said publishing is a little confused right now.
Yeah, it's a little, isn't it? So all we can do is what interests us, because it doesn't make sense.
Laurie, I know that you've struggled. Struggled is, I don't want to make it sound terrible, too terrible.
Oh, I suffer.
Well, struggled with the publisher's basic attitude, which is, I've always said about series, we want you to write a book just like the last one, except different.
Yeah.
You know, that's their feeling about series. And by God, you had a successful series. Don't you dare think about writing something that isn't the next volume in the series.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's tough, isn't it? You're not going to cry large crocodile tears at having a successful series, because honestly, you know, I live in a house paid for by Mary Russell. On the other hand, it is a bit of a trap in that, and every time I step out, people say, "Oh, that's okay, I'll wait for the next Russell," okay.
Well, David, they don't know what to wait for from you.
Well, I have a steady readership. I gain, let's say with The Spies, I gained, and I really, those espionage books had an influence, and so I'd go over and do something else, and then I'd gain new readers while I'd lose the espionage fans. And what I realized was that I was naive. I realized I didn't understand that readers are not loyal to an author unless the author writes the same thing that attracted them in the first place.
It's like going to McDonald's, I've always said. You know, you don't want to wonder, is this McDonald's going to be as good as that McDonald's over there? You know, and unfortunately, there's a lot of readers like that.
Well, they're right. If they're for the historical Western, first of all, I've been reading, the book is set in 1888 for reasons that one will understand in the story. So I'm reading everything I can about everything in the West from this post-Civil War onward, and the progression. And it helps that I belong to a Western watching group. I'm in Western Writers of America. I'm on the board, in fact. And I belong to a Western watching group that's been meeting once a month for 11 years now, watching 2 Westerns a month, and then going over to the novels. And I'm on a Elmore Leonard Western kick at the moment, and he was very good as a Western writer. And so I'm just going tearing it all through. And said to myself, you know, I did like his crime novels. And then I'm thinking, but if somebody offered me a Elmore Leonard crime novel, I wouldn't read it because I'm reading these Westerns. So it's very easy to see how we self-select about this.
Yes.
And that's the reader's right.
What do you guys think is the climate today for a new writer? Is it, I mean, some have said to me, oh, the publishers now just want the A-plus listers. You know, if they could publish only Michael Connelly and Lee Child and Janet Ivanovich, they'd be very happy. They wouldn't want to ever publish anybody else. Maybe David Morrell, maybe, you know. Laurie King, I don't know, you know, you're not selling millions, you know, you're only selling hundreds of thousands. So I'm not sure. Has it changed? Is it harder for new writers today, or easier because of ebooks and self-publishing?
I'm very glad that I'm not getting started today. I'm really at home in the traditional publishing world. I mean, I couldn't do self-pub. I have done self-pub, but I couldn't do it to earn a living because I am too dependent on working in the community of publishing. I need an editor who is paid by a house to be critical rather than paid by me to be sort of critical. And you know, to get started in that as a new writer today is really tough. So yeah, I agree. It's not an easy time to get started.
David, you think big changes are coming in publishing, or?
I see a contraction, and I don't know how long that's going to last. I see fewer kinds of topics. I mean, I offered an editor, because I get a lot of requests for, will you write another Brotherhood of the Rose book? So I said, you know, it's been a long time. Would you like one? No, the series is too old. So then I said, how about another De Quincey novel? I mean, this isn't like me, you know, going on the block here. These are books that I would care about, that were important to me. And they said, well, you know, contemporaries, maybe do something contemporary. And you know, after a while I got to think, I feel like I'm in the grocery store.
Right.
We get these questions a lot. I have 2 answers for writers. What is my advice? The answer, I have 2 mantras. One is, be a first-rate version of yourself and not a second-rate version of another author. And the other is, don't chase the market. You'll always see its backside. And all we can do, and we 4, I think, are examples. We do what we want. We do what is in our core, and there's no mistaking what we do, but for any other author. And I worry that some authors are maybe going to chase the domestic noir Gone Girl market, which is still very vital. And there's some very good books in them. I admire some of them, but it's not something I care to do. I just don't have the affinity for it. And so some authors might choose to go in that direction, but what happens when the trend changes? Then what? And all I can do is say, look, you can either write a book that you wasted your time on because you didn't care about it and the trend changed, or else you can write a book that you do care about. And if it isn't published, at least you know you didn't waste your time, because when you came out of it, you were a fuller person.
Right.
And that's the only logic I can make out of this.
Do you guys read while you're writing? Do you read other people's books that aren't research? Or do you
Laurie?
stay away from it? Some writers, you know, they don't want to read while they're writing.
I don't tend to read in the genre. I get to the end of the day and I've been building the plots all day, and I want to read something that I usually read science fiction or that sort of thing at night, because it works a different part of the brain.
For me, it's immersive. So I read a lot of history, and it's usually relevant to, you know, whatever is, since I'm on this historical trend. For me, so I've been reading a lot of books about the West and learning a tremendous amount that I hadn't understood before. And then I'm also I have a theory that if you write in a genre, you should know that genre well enough that you can teach it, that you could go in a literary classroom and teach it. So I've been teaching myself the history of the Western, starting with Cooper, James Fenimore Cooper, who's our first frontier novelist, and moving forward. But in the modern era, the first Western was the Virginian. And the next one after that, the next important one by Zane Grey, was Riders of the Purple Sage. What a great title. And its sequel, The Rainbow Trail. And so I've been moving up through that, looking for how the genre got established, so that since I'm writing a meta Western, that I could, you know, be self-referential about that stuff. Doesn't that sound crazy? I think I should be back as a professor and not, you know, but I know some people are going to enjoy this, that they're going to be, did you all see Once Upon a Time in Hollywood?
Yes.
I went crazy about that movie. I saw that 6 times in a theater because it was so self-reflexive.
Of course. Yes.
And that's one of the reasons why I persisted in what I'm doing. I said, I wonder if I can write a Western that's as self-referential as Once Upon a Time in Hollywood.
It's always interesting to see when someone, especially if they are a mainstream novelist and usually prize-winning mainstream novelist, decides to write genre, because they've always loved the genre. It's not that they're slumming; it's that they love the genre, and so they decide to write in it. And it's always interesting because often their first attempt is not really on the mark. They get sort of 7 out of 10, and then maybe 1 or 2 that kind of work, but they don't really grasp that there are very tight rules to writing in mysteries, that you can break if you want, but you can't be unaware of them, because otherwise it just doesn't work.
Yeah, I think, you know, we'd be hard pressed at that to name a mainstream author who has also written some great genre. I mean, Gore Vidal's Edgar Box, those are not great books. I'm thinking of others that have tried, and yeah, it's.
You know, I love Kate Atkinson's books, the case histories, but they're not, you know, as mysteries. They're not written in the genre. They're written by a literary writer who's writing mysteries. Which I think is fun. It's something I'm thinking about a lot now, because I'm working with Lee Child on writing a new Mystery Writers of America handbook, and we've invited, you know, 30 people, and there's a lot of people who've contributed bits to go into it. So we're piecing these together, and to write about, you know, a whole handbook on writing, what the rules are, why the rules are there, and why they sometimes should be broken. It's just a fascinating exercise.
Do I get to write a piece on footnotes?
I only wish we had room for footnotes. We'll have to have you footnote one of our chapters, Les.
Well, I was thinking of more of an essay about how to write footnotes, sort of, you know.
No, let's be meta and have you write a footnote chapter made up of footnotes.
There you are. There you are. What fun. What fun.
David, are you finding it hard to write in the current situation?
Yes, because, well, not because I'm working on this Western, and for you all, it's the same thing. We're going back in time so that we don't have the problems that someone who is a contemporary author has to figure out, has to predict how our culture is going to change.
Right.
And will certain conventions that we took for granted now seem so unusual that the novels will feel dated, so to speak. I know
Like
one
all those
author.
movies in which you see people smoking and you say, what?
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's a good example. I was speaking to my agent, and the agent said that they were getting pandemic novels. Now, what would possess you to write that? I mean, that's not what anybody's going to want to write about. I'm reminded at the last time we had an upheaval like this, but it can't compare, was on 9/11. And for 9 months, editors would not buy action books because that was all done. We were never going to have that again. The world had changed, but it drifted back. So will what's happening now eventually cause us to drift back to the way things were, or are we going to enter into something new and unimagined in terms of the way our society conducts itself? And if you write a novel as if it were in 2018, is that going to look so archaic that people won't be able to identify with it? So I think for now, this isn't the reason to write a historical novel, but for now, it's a good direction because we don't have any of those problems.
Laurie, has the Spanish flu come up in any of the Russell novels? I don't think so. I don't recall.
No. I mean, I think it's maybe said in the Spanish flu, and I'm thinking, I live all day with this horrible series of information coming at me. I don't want to write about it too.
Oh, I understand. There's a book I've been recommending that came about a year ago called A Song for a New Day by Sarah Pinsker. It's up for a Hugo. It's a science fiction novel that imagines a society shortly after a pandemic and terrorist crisis, and we've all sort of gotten into a life of isolation. It was not written now. It was written a year ago. And
wow.
Very prescient and very interesting.
I mean, I have the Califia's Daughters, a similar setup. I mean, there's a huge epidemic that kills mostly men. No offense, guys, but you know, it kills men. And the huge changes that it happens and how people just withdraw because of the combination of this disease that has apparently been loosed from a test tube somewhere, and this everyday terrorism. People just, it changes society. So that one's science fiction rather than
yes. Well, thank you both so much for being with us, and keep writing.
Thank you, Les.
Thank you.
Good to talk to you, David.
Yeah, good to see you, even if it's all virtually. Really, I mean, I wish we could be all in the same general area, but
yes,
not to be.
No Comic-Con, no VoucherCon.
We'll all have a drink together somewhere.